parents disowned my children. For us, they are only the grandchildren of our beautiful daughter," said my mom. I asked, "Do you know who is really funding them?" Their faces. "For us, they are only our beautiful daughter's grandchildren," my mother said on the phone. I asked, "Do you know who is really funding her?" There was a long silence. I could almost hear her brain trying to process what I had just said. But let's back up a little bit. This moment didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building up for years. Growing up, my parents made it painfully clear who their favorite child was: my sister, Emily. She was the golden girl, the straight-A student, the one who could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment. I struggled in school, got in trouble from time to time, and just didn't fit the mold they wanted. The difference in our treatment was so glaring that even our relatives noticed. At family gatherings, Emily was always praised and showered with attention, while I was an afterthought. I had hoped that things would change as we grew older, that perhaps adulthood would level the playing field. It didn't. When Emily became a lawyer, my parents worshipped her. When I started my own business, they barely acknowledged it. Still, I never cut them off. I wanted my children to have grandparents, even if they were distant. When my wife and I had our first child, my parents were polite but cold. They babysat a few times, but only because I begged them to. Then Emily had her first child and everything changed. My parents were at her house all the time. They threw her baby showers, posted about their perfect grandchild on social media, and made it clear that this was the grandchild that mattered. When she had her second, they practically lived in her house and helped with everything. Meanwhile, when I asked them to watch my kids for just one night because my wife and I had an important business meeting, my mother scoffed. "We don't want to watch your children," she snapped. "We just want grandchildren from our beautiful daughter. You were always worse than her, so your children will grow up to be losers like you." I could barely breathe. I stood there holding the phone, my hand shaking. After all this, after all these years of being the outsider in my own family, I had hoped foolishly that my children would be different. That my parents would love them, even if they never really loved me. I hung up without another word. I got dressed, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to their house. I didn't even have a plan. I just knew I wasn't going to let this go. When I got there, my father answered the door. He looked surprised to see me, but before he could say anything, I pushed my way past him and into the living room, where my mother was sitting on the couch. She barely looked up from her cell phone. I didn't even sit down. I just said, "Why?" She sighed and put the phone down. "Douglas, we've been through this. Emily has always been responsible, and you think my kids don't deserve grandparents because you don't like me?" My voice rose, but I didn't care. My mother gave me that condescending look she always gave me, the one that made me feel like I was still a 10-year-old boy who had failed a math test. "Douglas, you have to understand. Some people just shine more than others." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Do you even know who paid for Emily's life?" That got her attention. She frowned. "What are you talking about?" I crossed my arms. "Emily's not a successful lawyer. She was laid off over a year ago. Her husband's salary was cut, and they're drowning in debt. For the past 15 months, I've been paying their rent, their kids' school fees, and even some of their credit card bills." My father, who had been listening behind my mother, turned pale. My mother's face fell in confusion. "That's ridiculous," she scoffed. "She would have told us. She didn't because she didn't want you to know that your perfect daughter was struggling. And before you start making excuses, do you know why she won't leave her husband? Because he beats her. And you know what else? She hates the way you treat her like a child. She complains that you control her every move." My mother's jaw actually dropped. For the first time in my life, I saw her speechless. My father looked like someone had just punched him in the stomach. And that was just the beginning. Silence. My mother just stared at me, her lips parted slightly, while my father sat back in his chair, looking pale. "That's not true," my mother finally muttered. "Emily would have told us. I shook my head. She didn't because she knew you wouldn't believe it. She lost her job over a year ago. Her husband's salary was cut. They're in debt. I'm the one keeping them afloat. My dad ran his hand over his face. Why wouldn't she come to us? Because you don't listen. You treat her like a child. She doesn't want to hear how she failed you. My mother still looked doubtful. But she seems happy. She's putting on a show. Do you really think she's going to post online about how her husband controls her? How he got her pregnant on purpose so she wouldn't leave? This one hit hard. My mom's face tightened. My dad muttered, "Jesus," under his breath. I let out a short laugh. And the best part? She complains about you. Says you smother her. Says you're overbearing. That's why she doesn't tell you anything. They looked really shaken now. For once, they didn't have an answer. My mother spoke first. We need to talk to her. I nodded. And you need to ask yourselves if you're ready to be grandparents to all your grandchildren. Because I'm done chasing you. I turned to leave. My father spoke softly. Douglas, we're sorry. I didn't look back. We'll see. I walked out, thinking it was over. It wasn't. I thought that was the end of it. I'd said my piece, walked away, and figured they'd either finally wake up or go back to their old ways. The next morning, my phone started buzzing nonstop. First it was Emily. Then her husband. Then my mother. I ignored them all at first, but then Emily texted. Get Mom and Dad out of my apartment. Now. That got my attention. I called them. She picked up immediately and whispered angrily. What the hell did you say to them? Before I could answer, I heard shouting in the background. My father's voice, loud and angry. Then a man's voice, Emily's husband, yelling back. Are they fighting? I asked. Yes. Dad showed up this morning demanding answers, and now he and Eric are about to kill each other in my living room. Get over here before someone calls the police. I grabbed my keys and left without another word. By the time I got to Emily's apartment, the situation was out of control. My father was standing face to face with Eric, his face red with rage. Eric looked just as angry, but there was something else, discomfort. Like he wasn't used to being confronted like this. My mother stood off to the side, watching nervously. Emily looked completely exhausted, her arms crossed, her eyes darting between the two men as if waiting for a bomb to go off. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. What the hell is going on? My father pointed at Eric. That piece of garbage got his hands on my daughter. Eric scoffed. Stay out of my marriage, old man. My dad took a step closer. Or what? For a second, I actually thought they were going to start throwing punches. But Eric didn't move. That's when I realized he wasn't used to being challenged. He was used to controlling the situation and keeping Emily under his thumb. But now, with my father in his face, he wasn't so sure of himself. I turned to Emily. What did they say to you? She ran a hand through her hair. They came over early this morning and said they needed to talk. Then Dad started pushing for answers, and Eric got defensive. Things escalated from there. I looked at my mother. And you? She hesitated. I just wanted to understand why she didn't tell us. I let out a short laugh. Well, congratulations. Now you know. Emily let out a frustrated sigh. I told you not to say anything, Doug. Now everything is worse. I looked at her, then at Eric, then at my father. No, it's not. For the first time, he's out of control. Eric's eyes flashed with anger. This is none of your business. I stepped closer and lowered my voice. You made it my business the second you started treating my sister like garbage. He glared at me, but I saw the flicker of something else, uncertainty. My father turned to Emily. Pack your things. You and the kids are coming with us. Eric let out a sharp laugh. She's not going anywhere. And then, to my surprise, my mother spoke. Yes. She is. Eric looked at her, clearly surprised. Emily hesitated, her eyes darting between all of us. She had been stuck in this toxic cycle for years. I knew she was scared. I also knew that this was her moment, her chance to finally break free. And then she did something none of us saw coming. She said, "Okay." Eric's face darkened. "You're not serious." Emily took a deep breath. "I am." Eric took a step toward her, but this time my father blocked his path. "If you touch her, I will end you," he said, his voice cold. Eric didn't move. He just stood there, fists clenched, breathing heavily. And then he said, "You will regret this." That's when I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Eric stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his fists clenching and unclenching, as if debating whether to throw a punch. But with my father standing between him and Emily, he didn't dare. "You're making a mistake," he said, looking at Emily. "You think they'll save you? They'll just control you like they always have." Emily hesitated. That was the part of her that had been conditioned to doubt herself. The part of her that Eric had manipulated for years. But then she squared her shoulders and said, "I'll take my chances." Eric let out a bitter laugh. Then, without another word, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out, slamming the door behind him so hard that a picture on the wall rattled. The silence that followed was heavy. Emily stood there, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the door as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. My mother exhaled shakily. My father ran his hand over his face and sat down on the couch, as if the weight of everything had just caught up with him. Finally I said, "Well, that was dramatic." Emily let out a short, weary laugh and shook her head. "Yeah. No kidding." We all sat down in the living room. For the first time in years, it felt like we were having a real family conversation. Emily opened up more about her situation, admitting how trapped she had felt for so long. My father sat quietly and listened. My mother still looked overwhelmed, but to my surprise, she actually showed concern instead of just shrugging it off. "I just don't understand," she muttered. "Why didn't you tell us before?" Emily sighed. "Because I knew you judged me. And I knew you tried to fix things your way instead of listening to what I needed." That hit my mother hard. She nodded slowly, like she was finally starting to get it. Then, predictably, the change happened. In spite of everything, my parents still put Emily first. They immediately started talking about how they could help her, offering to let her move in with them, saying they'd help with the kids, making plans. I sat back and watched because I knew exactly how this was going to go. They'd rally around her because she was still their golden child. But something was different this time. Because when my father turned to me, he said, "Douglas, I know you've done a lot for her. I didn't realize how much. I should have." I just nodded. "Yes. You should have." For the first time, he didn't get defensive. He just nodded back. And that was the start of something new. A few weeks passed. Emily stayed with my parents while she figured out her next steps. Things weren't perfect, but they were different. My parents still favored her, but they also made an effort to include me more. My father even called me a few times just to talk, something he had never done before. But then, one night, I got a text from an unknown number. "You think this is over? Watch your back." I knew exactly who it was from. Eric. The next morning, I showed up at my parents' house. Emily was sitting in the kitchen with my mom, drinking coffee. She looked tired, but more herself. Stronger. I put my phone down on the table. "Eric's trying to start something." Emily's face tightened. She read the message and sighed. "Ignore him. He's just trying to scare you." "He's not trying to scare me," I said. "But I don't trust him not to do something stupid." Just then, my father walked in. "What's going on?" I showed him the text. He read it slowly, then looked at me. "You want me to handle this?" That took me by surprise. "You?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes. Me." I studied his face. He was serious. For the first time in my life, my father was standing up for me without me having to ask. I let out a breath and shook my head. No. I got it. He nodded. All right. But if he tries anything, call me. I don't know why, but that hit me harder than anything else. He had never supported me before. Not like this. And for the first time, I felt like I had a real father. I wasn't afraid of Eric. But I knew guys like him, cowards who only felt powerful when they were in control. And now that he had lost it, he was unpredictable. I half expected him to try something, but I didn't think it would be so soon. That night I was locking up my shop when I noticed a car idling across the street. At first I didn't think much of it. But then the driver's side door opened and Eric got out. I sighed. Of course. He walked toward me with that cocky grin, hands in his jacket pockets. So this is where all the money comes from, huh? Your little business? I didn't answer. I just crossed my arms and waited. He took a step closer. You really think you won? That she'll stay away from me forever? You don't know her like I do. She needs me. I laughed. She needs you like a hole in the head. That wiped the smirk off his face. You've been in my business since day one. Meddling. Making her think she could live without me. She can live without you, I said. That's kind of the point. His jaw clenched. You're a real pain in the ass, you know that? Yeah, I've been told. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. I could ruin your life like you ruined mine. That's when I felt it. The shift. The tension in the air. He wasn't just talking. He was trying something. I saw it in his eyes. He thought he could intimidate me, maybe even start a fight and walk away the winner. I wasn't going to let him. So I took a step forward, closing the space between us. Go ahead, I said quietly. Try me. For a second, he looked like he might. His hands twitched in his pockets. But then he hesitated. Then I heard another voice behind me. You got a problem, Eric? I turned. My father was standing in front of his car, arms crossed. Eric's face changed. He took half a step back. This doesn't concern you, old man. My dad took a step forward. It does if you threaten my son. My son. I don't think I'd ever heard those words come out of his mouth with so much weight. Eric looked between the two of us, as if trying to decide if this was worth it. Then, just like that, he scoffed, turned and walked back to his car. As he drove away, my dad exhaled. Coward! I turned to him. How did you know? I had a feeling, he said. Thought I'd check in. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. For the first time in my life, my father had decided to support me. No hesitation. No conditions. And damn, it felt good. After that night, Eric didn't try anything again, not directly. But Emily began to get messages from him. At first they were apologies. Then, when she didn't respond, they became guilt trips. Then threats. I knew he wouldn't just walk away. Emily muttered, showing me one of his texts. You really think they'll save you? They'll come crawling back. They always do. That was it. I was done playing defense. I called my parents and told them to meet me at their house. When I got there, Emily was already sitting in the living room, arms folded, looking exhausted. My father looked serious. My mother looked angry. We're done waiting for him to come to, I said. We have to end this. My father nodded. Agreed. To my surprise, it was my mother who spoke next. We'll get you a lawyer. Emily blinked. A lawyer? My mother sat down beside her. Yes. A divorce lawyer. And a restraining order. We're ending this on our terms. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother, who had spent her whole life trying to control Emily, was now taking action for her instead of against her. Emily hesitated. Do you really think Dash? My father cut her off. Yes. You need to be legally free of him. We'll take care of everything. But you need to sign the papers and be ready to fight if he resists. Emily exhaled. Okay. That same day, we met with a lawyer my dad knew. He was ruthless. After looking over the situation, he smiled and said, "He's not going to fight this. Not if we do it right." And he was right. Eric tried to resist at first, sending more messages, making more threats, but when he got a formal notice from the lawyer, his attitude changed. He suddenly became very cooperative. Because he knew that if this went to court, he would lose. A month later, the divorce was finalized, the restraining order was in place, and Eric was out of Emily's life. And for the first time in years, she was actually free. Things didn't magically get perfect after that. My parents were still my parents, flawed, stubborn, and sometimes frustrating. They still favored Emily in small ways, but they had also changed. They treated me differently now. Not like the black sheep. Not like the disappointment. Like a son. One night I was at their house, sitting on the back porch with my father. We weren't saying much, just drinking and looking out at the yard. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You did good, Douglas." I turned to him in surprise. He nodded. "You saved them. Not us." "You did." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded back. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself to him. He already knew. I expected things to settle down after the divorce, but what I didn't expect was how much better things got. First, Eric got exactly what he deserved. The court took one look at the evidence, Emily's testimony, the restraining order, even the threats he had made, and shut him down completely. Not only was he forced to pay alimony and child support, but he lost all custody rights. The judge ruled that he was unfit to be around the children after everything he had done. Of course he tried to fight it. Threw a fit in court. But he had nothing. No job stability, no decent lawyer, and worst of all for him, no control. He lost. For the first time, Emily didn't. After the dust settled, a strange thing happened. My parents, especially my mother, actually started making an effort. Not just with Emily, but with me. They invited me over more. They actually asked me about my life, my business. My dad would call me just to check in. My mom started sending gifts for my kids. At first I thought it was guilt. But over time I realized it wasn't just that. For the first time, they saw me as more than the troubled kid who never measured up. They saw me for what I had always been, someone who took care of his own. Someone strong. Someone worthy of their respect. And the best part? They actually started treating my kids like real grandchildren. They babysat. They showed up at birthdays. My mom even started bragging about them the way she used to brag about Emily's kids. I'm not going to lie and say that it completely erased the past. It didn't. But for the first time, I wasn't holding on to all that anger. I wasn't chasing their approval. I already had what mattered. My wife. My kids. My business. And now a sister who was finally free. And maybe, just maybe, a family that wasn't broken anymore.